There are moments in life that split everything in two, the before and the after. And the terrifying thing is you never see them coming. They don't announce themselves. They don't give you time to prepare. They arrive quietly, without warning, in the most ordinary forms: a phone call, a knock at the door, a name you don't recognize on a piece of paper. And sometimes, on the most devastating day of your life, when the ground beneath you is already shifting and you are already barely holding yourself together. They arrive as 4 words on a glowing screen. 4 words that make you question everything, not just the last week, not just the last month, but 15 years, every morning, every dinner, every "I love you," every single thing you believe to be true about the person lying in the casket in front of you. This is the story of Margaret Calloway. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. What happened to Margaret did not happen because she was naive. It did not happen because she was foolish. It happened because she loved someone, and she trusted him. And for 15 years, he let her. On the morning of October 14th, Margaret Calloway stood at the edge of a freshly dug grave in Clarkston, Tennessee, wearing the black dress she had bought in a fog 3 days earlier, holding a single white lily in both hands. She had barely slept since the phone call. She had barely eaten. She had spent the days between Daniel's death and this morning doing what women like Margaret do. She made the arrangements. She had called the family. She had answered every knock at the door. She had accepted every casserole and every hug and every "he was such a good man" with grace, because that is what Margaret knew how to do. She had been doing it her whole life. She was 53 years old. She had been married to Daniel Calloway for 15 of those years. And standing there at his graveside in the cold October air, with a pastor's voice rising and falling over the crowd of mourners, Margaret had one single goal: get through the next hour. Just get through it. She was so close. The hymn was starting. The choir was singing. And then her phone buzzed. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Before we get deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the stories we bring you, they are the ones that remind you that truth is almost always stranger and sadder and more complicated than anything we could make up. Now, back to Margaret, back to that buzzing phone, back to the text that changed everything. Margaret would later tell people that she almost didn't look at it. She almost let it go to voicemail, except it was a text, not a call. And something about the vibration, the persistence of it, made her hand move before her mind could stop it. She reached into her purse. She looked down at the screen, and the message that greeted her was not from a name she recognized. It was from a number she had never seen. And it said simply, "We need to talk. I know what really happened." She read it once. She read it twice. She stood there at her husband's graveside, his casket still above the ground, the earth still waiting to receive him, and she read those 6 words a third time. And in that moment, 3 questions formed in Margaret's mind that would not leave her alone for the next 14 months. The first question was this: who sent that text? Because the number was not in her phone. The name was not in her phone. And yet, whoever was on the other end of that message had found her at the exact moment her husband was being lowered into the ground, and had chosen that moment specifically to reach out. Not before the funeral, not after, that moment. The second question was harder. What did they mean by what really happened? Daniel had died of a heart attack. The doctors had confirmed it. The death certificate had been filed. There had been no investigation, no questions, no reason for anyone to use a phrase like "what really happened," and yet someone had. Someone who was either at that funeral or knew exactly when it was taking place. And the third question, the one that would keep Margaret awake for weeks, was the one she was most afraid to ask herself. Because somewhere deep in the part of her that had spent 15 years noticing small things and choosing not to look too closely, the third question was already forming. And the third question was this: had she already known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that something was wrong? Had she always known? And had she simply all this time chosen not to ask? To understand what happened to Margaret Calloway, to truly understand it, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the day of the funeral. Not even to the day Daniel died. You have to go back to the woman Margaret was before any of this happened. You have to go back to Clarkston, Tennessee. Because Clarkston is the kind of place that shapes you in ways you don't fully understand until you leave, or until life forces you to see it clearly. It is a small town in the eastern part of the state, tucked between rolling hills and a single main road with a gas station, a diner, a hardware store, and a Baptist church that has stood in the same spot since 1891. The kind of town where people wave at each other on the road even when they don't know who's driving. The kind of town where your reputation matters, where your family name means something, where doing the right thing and keeping the peace are treated almost as the same virtue. Margaret Ann Hargrove grew up there. She was the second of three daughters born to Robert and Carol Hargrove. Her father, a high school history teacher. Her mother, a homemaker who also ran the church choir for 26 years. They were not wealthy. They were comfortable in the way that small-town families can be comfortable. Not because of money, but because of community. Because of knowing your neighbors. Because of belonging somewhere. Margaret was, by every account from people who knew her growing up, a quiet girl. Not shy, exactly. She was warm. She was present. She had a laugh that people remembered. But she was the kind of quiet that comes from being thoughtful, from watching, from listening more than she spoke. She was a reader. By the time she was 12 years old, she had made her way through every Nancy Drew novel the Clarkston Public Library owned, and she had started on the adult fiction section because she had simply run out of other things to read. Books were her world, and so it was perhaps not surprising that she eventually became a librarian. For 22 years, Margaret Calloway, then Margaret Hargrove, worked at the Clarkston Middle School Library. She was the kind of librarian who remembered what every student had checked out, who knew exactly which book to put in a struggling reader's hands, who stayed late and came in early and never once complained about it, because she genuinely loved the work. She genuinely loved the kids. That was just who she was. She was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a good person. And good people, the ones who believe in goodness, the ones who try to see the best in everyone around them, those are often the people who are the most blindsided, because they extend to the people they love the same grace they extend to everyone else. They assume the best. They fill in the gaps with hope. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the people who are supposed to protect that grace are the very ones who exploit it. Margaret met Daniel Calloway when she was 37 years old. She had not been in a serious relationship since a long engagement in her late 20s that had ended quietly and painfully, and she had spent most of her 30s building her life, carefully, deliberately, on her own terms. She had her house, she had her job, she had her sister Donna, who lived 20 minutes away and who was, and remains to this day, the closest person to Margaret in the world. She had her books, her church, her garden, her routines. She was not lonely, exactly, but she was aware, in the way that people in their late 30s sometimes are, of a kind of particular quiet in the house, an absence that she hadn't fully named. And then she met Daniel. He came to Clarkston to bid on a renovation project at the school, a new addition to the gymnasium. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile and a handshake that made people feel immediately at ease. He was a contractor, his own business, built from the ground up over 15 years. He was charming without being slick about it. The kind of charming that doesn't feel like a performance, that feels genuine. He had been married once before, briefly, in his early 30s, no children. He described it as a mistake we both made young, and he said it with such equanimity, such lack of bitterness, that it only made him seem more mature, more evolved. He was funny, he was kind, he remembered details. On their third date, he mentioned a book she had told him about on their first date, and he had gone out and bought it, and he had read 30 pages and wanted to talk about them. Margaret was not a woman who fell easily, but she fell. She fell the way people fall when they have been careful for a long time, all at once and completely. They dated for 2 years. They were married in the spring, when Margaret was 39 years old, in a small ceremony at the Baptist church where her mother had run the choir for a quarter-century. Her father walked her down the aisle. Daniel's brother Gary flew in from Phoenix to be his best man. There were 43 people at the reception, held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with white flowers and mason jars and string lights. Margaret's sister Donna gave a toast that made everyone cry, and by all accounts, every person who was there that day believed they were watching two people who had found, at the exact right time in their lives, exactly the right person. They believed that because Margaret believed it, and she had no reason not to. For the first few years, the marriage was good, genuinely good. Daniel was present in the way that Margaret had hoped he would be. He showed up, he was reliable. He fixed things around the house without being asked. He took her to dinner on their anniversary every single year without exception. They traveled a little, a trip to Gatlinburg every fall, one trip to Savannah that Margaret still describes as one of the best weeks of her life. They had disagreements the way married people do, but they were small, manageable things. The marriage was not perfect. No marriage is. But it was solid, or so Margaret believed. The cracks, she will tell you now, were always there. Small things that she noticed in the way that you notice something peripheral, in the corner of your eye, and then choose not to examine too closely. the phone that was always face down on the table when he was home. She had noticed it early on within the first year of marriage, and when she asked about it, Daniel had laughed and said he just had a habit of flipping it over so the light didn't distract him. It was such a reasonable explanation, such a simple answer, and she had accepted it. The home office with the locked drawer was something she had asked about exactly once. In the third year of their marriage, when she needed a pen and the regular drawer was empty, Daniel had explained it as business files, legal documents. He said he kept them locked for professional reasons in case clients ever came to the house. Again, reasonable. Again, she accepted it. The nights that ran late, the jobs that sometimes took him out of town for a few days at a time, the phone calls he took in the garage, all of it, when examined individually, added up to nothing. Added up to a busy man with a demanding business. Added up to a husband who was providing for his family. And Margaret, who had learned somewhere along the way that asking too many questions felt like distrust, who had grown up in a house where you gave people the benefit of the doubt because that was the charitable thing to do, Margaret had continued to do what she always did. She gave him the benefit of the doubt. She filled in the gaps with love, and she let it go. She let it go for 12 more years, until she couldn't anymore. Because on the morning of October 11th, 3 days before she stood at his grave, Margaret had received a different kind of phone call. Not a text, not a number she didn't recognize. It was the Harlan County Sheriff's Office. And the deputy on the line had told her, in the measured, careful tone that officers use when they are delivering the worst possible news, that her husband had collapsed at a job site just outside of town, that the paramedics had been called immediately, that everything that could be done had been done, and that Daniel Raymond Calloway was gone. He was 57 years old. Heart attack, no warning, no indication. Just here one moment and gone the next. And in the days that followed, as Margaret moved through the terrible administrative numbness of sudden death, the death certificate, the funeral home, the flowers, the calls, she did what she had always done. She held herself together. She was steady. She was present. She was, to everyone around her, the model of dignified grief. And inside she was shattered. Because whatever Daniel's flaws had been, whatever small uncertainties had gathered, over the years at the edges of their life together, she had loved him. She had genuinely, completely loved him. And the loss was real. It was physical. It was the kind of grief that sits on your chest at 3 in the morning and makes it hard to breathe. And so when she stood at that graveside on October 14th and her phone buzzed in her purse, she was not a woman looking for trouble. She was not a woman looking for answers. She was a woman simply trying to survive the next 60 minutes. And instead, she got 6 words that would undo everything. We need to talk. I know what really happened. The funeral service at Clarkston Baptist Church lasted 45 minutes. The pastor, Reverend James Whitfield, who had known both Margaret and Daniel for the full 15 years of their marriage, delivered a eulogy that described Daniel as a man of integrity and hard work, a man who had given back to his community, a man who would be missed. 3 of Daniel's longtime clients sat together in the third row. His brother Gary sat next to Margaret, his hand on hers for most of the service. Donna sat on Margaret's other side, as she had been sitting at Margaret's side for every significant moment of her life. The church was full. There were people standing at the back, and through all of it, through the scripture readings and the music and the tears and the low murmur of grief that filled that small sanctuary, Margaret kept her hand in her purse, her fingers resting on her phone, reading those 6 words over and over until they blurred and rearranged themselves, and she could no longer be sure she had read them correctly. She had read them correctly. She had not replied. Not yet. She got through the service. She got through the drive to the cemetery in the long black car, watching the Tennessee countryside pass outside the window and thinking about absolutely nothing, which is sometimes the only way to get through things. She got through the graveside ceremony, which was blessedly short. 10 minutes, a prayer, a final hymn, and then the slow, terrible moment of watching the casket begin its descent. She got through the reception at the house, which her neighbor Linda Patterson had organized entirely, and for which Margaret was more grateful than she could say. She smiled and shook hands and accepted condolences from people she had known for 20 years. She said, "Thank you so much for coming," 67 times she counted, because counting was something her mind could hold on to when everything else was sliding. She drank 1 cup of coffee and ate exactly half a piece of cornbread and stood in her kitchen, in the house she had shared with Daniel for 12 years, and she did not let herself fall apart. Not yet. Her son David, 24 years old, Daniel's stepson, the child from Margaret's first long relationship, who Daniel had raised as his own since the age of 9, had driven through night from Atlanta and arrived 2 hours before the service. He stayed through the reception, helped carry dishes back to the kitchen, and fell asleep on the living room couch at 8:30 that evening, still wearing his dress shirt, his shoes still on his feet. Margaret covered him with a blanket. She turned off all the lights except the small one over the stove. And then she sat down at her kitchen table, in her own house, in the silence that follows the worst kind of day, and she picked up her phone. She opened the message. She read it one more time. And this time she typed back. She typed 2 words, "Who is this?" She pressed send. She set the phone face up on the table, which was something Daniel never did, and she had always thought was strange. And now she understood why, and she waited. The reply came in 53 seconds. She would remember that detail with perfect clarity for years afterward. 53 seconds. And what came back was not what she expected. Nothing about what came next would be what she expected. The message read, "My name is Carol Winstead. I was Daniel's business associate. And Margaret, I am so sorry for your loss and for what I'm about to tell you. But I think you may be in danger, and I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Margaret read that message 6 times. She would tell her sister Donna about it the next morning, and Donna would later describe Margaret's voice on that phone call as the calmest she had ever heard her. Not the calm of someone who wasn't scared, but the calm of someone who had, in the back of their mind, been waiting for exactly this. Not this specific message, not these specific words, but something. Some version of the other shoe dropping. Margaret had been waiting for it without knowing she was waiting for it for a very long time. Carol Winstead was a name that had never once appeared in 15 years of marriage. Not in conversation, not in a business card, not in a file, not in any context that Margaret could recall. And Daniel, who had always said he preferred to work alone, who had always described his contracting business as a solo operation, who had told Margaret that he handled all of his own bids and his own books and his own relationships with clients because that's just how I've always done it. Daniel, it turned out, had a business associate, a woman, named Carol, who had Margaret's personal cell phone number, who had known, somehow, exactly when and where the funeral was being held, and who, within hours of Daniel being lowered into the ground, had reached out to say that Margaret might be in danger. The question that pressed on Margaret all through that sleepless night, with David breathing slowly on the couch in the next room in the house so quiet she could hear the furnace cycling on and off, was not yet what did Daniel do. That question would come. It was already forming. But the question that pressed most urgently in those first dark hours was simpler and more immediate. It was, who is Carol Winstead? And why does she have my number? Carol Winstead, as Margaret would discover over the course of 3 long phone calls across the next 3 nights, was 51 years old. She lived in Nashville. She was a real estate investor, small scale. She was careful to clarify, not a developer, not a company, just a private individual who had been flipping modest properties on the side for the better part of a decade. She had met Daniel Calloway at a property auction in Nashville 11 years ago. He had been there bidding on a small commercial space in a neighborhood she was also watching. They had struck up a conversation. He had been charming and knowledgeable, and crucially, had access to contractor services that could add real value to an investment property. They had begun a professional arrangement, informal, no contracts, no official partnership. He would provide labor and oversight on renovations. She would handle the acquisition and the sale. They would split the proceeds. It had worked, she told Margaret, for the first several years. Small deals, modest returns, nothing that would draw attention. And then about 6 years in, Carol had begun to notice things that didn't add up. Properties that were purchased under names she didn't recognize, names she had never agreed to use, names that were attached to LLCs she had never heard of, money that moved through accounts she had no visibility into. When she asked Daniel about it, he had explanations. He always had explanations. He was good at explanations. But the explanations had started to feel thin in the way that things feel thin when they are covering something substantial. And Carol, who was not a naive woman, had begun to keep her own records, her own copies of documents, her own notes on transactions she couldn't account for. She had kept those records for 4 years. She had told no one, because she was afraid. Not of Daniel specifically, she was careful to say this, and she would repeat it several times, but afraid of what the records might mean. Afraid of what might happen if she surfaced them. Afraid of the question she had been asking herself for years. How deep does this go? And then, 3 weeks before Daniel died, Carol had found the file. She described it in careful, precise terms, a manila folder thick with paper, tucked into the inner pocket of a briefcase Daniel had left at her Nashville office after a meeting about a property they were evaluating in Brentwood. She hadn't opened it intentionally. She had been going through the briefcase to return it to him, and the folder had slipped out. And once she had seen the first page, Once she had seen the name at the top of the first document, a name she didn't recognize, attached to a property deed for a house in Murfreesboro that she had never been told existed. She had kept reading, she had read every page, and what she found in that folder had kept her awake for 3 weeks straight before she finally, standing at the back of a Baptist church in Clarkston, Tennessee, sent a text to a woman she had never met. The folder contained deeds, financial ledgers, transfer records, and a name repeated across more than 40 documents, attached to properties and accounts and transactions stretching back nearly a decade. Not Daniel's name, not Carol's name, a third name, a woman. A woman whose identity would take Margaret's attorney another 3 weeks to fully trace. A woman who, according to the paperwork in that folder, had co-signed on properties and accounts totaling close to $400,000. And the last document in that folder, the one that Carol had held in her hands for 3 weeks without being able to decide what to do with it, was a life insurance policy, $1 million, taken out in Daniel's name 18 months earlier. And the beneficiary was not Margaret. It was not any member of Margaret's family. It was not anyone Margaret had ever heard of. The name on that beneficiary line was the same name that appeared on all the other documents, the same name over and over in Daniel's own handwriting on forms he had signed. The same name that would, over the course of the next 2 weeks, reshape everything Margaret thought she knew about her marriage, her husband, and the life they had built together in that small house in Clarkston, Tennessee. That night, after the second long phone call with Carol, after she had written down everything Carol had told her in a yellow legal pad, she had found in Daniel's study, after she had sat in the kitchen until past midnight replaying 15 years of small moments and reevaluating every one of them. Margaret did something she had never done in 15 years of marriage. She went to Daniel's home office. She stood in front of the locked drawer, the one he had always said contained business files, legal documents, the one she had asked about exactly once, 12 years ago, and had been given a reasonable answer and had accepted it and never asked again. She stood in front of it for a long moment, and then she went to the kitchen, got a butter knife, the most ordinary possible tool, which she would later describe as somehow exactly right, and she worked that lock open. It took 11 minutes. Her hands were steady the entire time, which surprised her. She would think about that steadiness later. She would decide it meant that some part of her had been waiting for this moment for longer than she knew. The drawer opened, and inside it, Margaret Calloway found 3 things. The first was a prepaid cell phone, a cheap basic model, not a smartphone, the kind you buy at a gas station. It was powered off. The second was a set of keys on a plain metal ring, no keychain, no label. A key that looked like it belonged to a house or an apartment, a deadbolt key, the standard kind, and a smaller key that might have belonged to a storage unit. And the third thing, the thing that Margaret picked up last and held in her hands for a very long time, was a handwritten note, a small piece of paper, folded once. 4 words in Daniel's handwriting. She recognized his handwriting. She had received birthday cards in that handwriting for 15 years. She had found grocery lists in that handwriting on the kitchen counter. She knew that handwriting the way you know the face of someone you have shared your bed with for a decade and a half. And those 4 words in that handwriting were, "Forgive me, I'm sorry," that was it. No name, no explanation, no date. Just those 4 words, written in the hand of a man who was now 3 days dead, in a drawer he had kept locked for 12 years, in a house that Margaret was beginning to realize she may not have fully known at all. She did not cry. She picked up her phone. She called her sister Donna. It was almost 1 in the morning. Donna answered on the second ring because that is the kind of sister Donna is, and Margaret said 5 words, "I need a lawyer now." And Donna, who had known her sister for 53 years, who had stood beside her at her wedding, and who had held her hand at the graveside that very afternoon, understood from those 5 words, and from the tone in which they were delivered, that something had broken open that could not be put back together. And she said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 18. The attorney Margaret retained was a woman named Patricia Greer, a 55-year-old estate and probate lawyer in Knoxville, whom Donna had found through a referral from her own attorney. Patricia had been practicing law for 28 years. She had handled estates and fraud cases and messy divorces and everything in between, and she would later say, in a conversation Margaret gave her permission to share, that the Calloway case was among the most methodically concealed financial arrangements she had ever encountered, not because it was elaborate in the technical sense, but because of how ordinary it all looked on the surface, how invisible, how completely it had been hidden inside a marriage that, from every outward appearance, had been perfectly, unremarkably normal. Patricia's first move was to pull every public record connected to Daniel Calloway's name. Business registrations, property records, court filings, tax liens, anything that existed in the public domain. What she found over the course of the first week was a picture that bore only partial resemblance to the man Margaret had been married to. Daniel had registered 2 LLCs in Tennessee that Margaret had never heard of. Neither one was connected to the contracting business she knew about. Both had been registered in the last 8 years, one 6 years ago, one 4 years ago. Both listed a registered agent that was not Daniel, not Carol, and not anyone in Margaret's world. And both of those LLCs appeared on the property documents that Carol had photographed from the folder in that briefcase. Patricia cross-referenced them against county recorder databases in 3 counties. What emerged was a trail of real estate transactions, small properties, mostly residential, nothing flashy, that had been moving through those 2 LLCs for the better part of a decade. Properties purchased, renovated, presumably using Daniel's contracting skills, and sold. The net proceeds, according to Patricia's accounting, were somewhere between $350,000 and $420,000, depending on which transactions could be definitively tied to Daniel's activity. None of that money had ever touched the joint accounts that Margaret and Daniel shared. None of it had appeared in any tax return Margaret had seen. None of it existed, as far as Margaret had known at all. And all of it, every deed, every transfer, every sale, bore a second signatory. The same name over and over. A woman named Renee Halton. Margaret had never heard the name Renee Halton in 15 years of marriage, not once. Not a mention at dinner, not a name on a Christmas card, not a passing reference in a conversation about work. The name had never existed in Margaret's life, but it had existed apparently in Daniel's life for a very long time. Renee Halton was 48 years old. She lived in a town called Shelbyville, about 40 miles south of Nashville. According to property records, she had purchased a modest house there 11 years ago. Right around the time, Patricia noted carefully, that Daniel and Carol Winstead had begun their arrangement. Renee had no professional profile that Patricia could easily find. She was not a real estate agent, not a licensed contractor, not a business owner in any registered sense. She appeared to be, from what Patricia could piece together, a private individual with no obvious means of income, who had nevertheless been co-signing on real estate transactions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars for nearly a decade. And she was, according to that life insurance policy document, the sole beneficiary of the $1 million policy Daniel had taken out on his own life 18 months before his death. Patricia flagged that policy immediately. She reached out to the insurance company, a large national carrier, and informed them that the estate was in dispute and that the policy was under legal review. The payout, which would otherwise have moved through probate in a relatively routine fashion, was frozen pending investigation. It was still frozen months later. It remained the subject of ongoing legal proceedings. And that frozen $1 million was, in many ways, the clearest evidence of what Daniel had been building. Not a life with Margaret, not a future for the two of them, but an exit. A clean, quiet, invisible exit that death had simply arrived at before he did. But here is the thing that Patricia kept returning to in her conversations with Margaret. The thing that, Margaret would say later, was in some ways harder to absorb than the money. Harder to absorb than the secret LLCs and the hidden properties and the name she had never heard. The prepaid phone. Patricia had connected with a cybersecurity consultant who was able to recover the message history from the prepaid phone Daniel had kept in that locked drawer. The phone had been wiped, not factory reset but manually deleted, message by message, over a period of time which told Patricia's consultant something important. It told him that Daniel had been periodically clearing the record. He had been managing the evidence of whatever that phone contained. He had been deliberate about it. But he hadn't been deliberate enough, because data deletion on a phone of that type is rarely truly complete, and what the consultant was able to partially reconstruct was enough. There had been hundreds of messages, spanning 4 years at minimum, possibly longer, and the messages were to and from one number, a number that, when traced, connected back to Renee Halton in Shelbyville. The content of those messages, which Patricia reviewed and Margaret chose not to read in full, and which Margaret has described only in general terms in the time since made, several things clear. The first was that Renee Halton was not simply a business partner. The second was that whatever their relationship was, it had been ongoing, consistent, and significant. And the third was the last message on that phone, sent the morning Daniel died, the morning of October 11th, sent from Daniel to Renee, at 7:43 in the morning, which was approximately 2 hours before he collapsed at the job site. 4 words, not the same 4 words as the note in the drawer. Different words. Words that Margaret's attorney shared with her in the privacy of a law office in Knoxville on a gray Tuesday morning. Words that Margaret absorbed quietly, with her hands folded in her lap, and then asked Patricia to never read aloud to her again. She knew what they said. That was enough. And then, 2 nights after Margaret had found the drawer, 2 nights after the discovery of the phone and the keys and the handwritten note, she woke up at 3:17 in the morning to a sound that her body understood before her mind did. The back door handle. Moving. Slowly, deliberately, the way a handle moves when someone is testing it. Not someone who is fumbling with keys in the dark. Not someone who has forgotten their key, but someone who is checking, who is assessing, who wants to know if the door is locked. She lay still for 3 seconds. Then she was out of bed. She did not turn on the lights. She did not go to the door. She went to her bedroom. She picked up her phone and she called 911. She told the dispatcher exactly what she had heard, exactly where she was, exactly what had been happening in the days leading up to this moment. She gave that information because she had been warned by Patricia's office that if anything unusual happened, she should report it immediately and give full context. The patrol car arrived in 9 minutes and 12 seconds. She would check the timestamp on her call log later. 2 officers searched the perimeter. They found no one. There were no footprints in the soft ground near the door because it had been dry that week and the ground was hard. There was nothing technically to confirm that anyone had been there at all, except for one thing. Her neighbor 2 houses down, a retired teacher named Bill Stratton, had a Ring camera mounted above his front door that captured a partial view of the street and the near side of Margaret's backyard. And when the officers reviewed it, which they did that same night, standing in Bill Stratton's living room at 3:30 in the morning while Bill stood in his bathrobe and Margaret sat in the patrol car, the footage showed a figure, moving along the property line, staying close to the shadows. The quality was what you would expect from a residential camera at 3 a.m. Grainy, indistinct, no clear identifying details. The figure was gone within 40 seconds. But they had been there. Someone had been there. Someone had come to Margaret's house in the middle of the night, 2 days after Daniel's funeral, and tested the back door. And now the question was no longer just about money. Now the question was not just about what Daniel had been hiding. Now the question was, who else knew and what did they want? The figure on the camera footage was never definitively identified. The Clarkston police took a report. They followed up. They spoke to several individuals whose names arose in the course of Patricia Greer's investigation, including, eventually, individuals who had been connected to the property transactions through the 2 LLCs. No charges were ever filed in connection with that night. No one was ever arrested for it. And Margaret, who moved a deadbolt to the back door the very next morning and had her locks rekeyed by the end of that week, made peace, eventually, with the fact that she might never know exactly who had been standing in her backyard at 3 a.m. But here is what she does know. What the investigation ultimately uncovered, piece by piece over the following 14 months, was a picture of a man who had been living 2 financial lives in parallel for nearly a decade. Not a second family. There was no indication of children, no second household, nothing so dramatic as that. What Daniel had been building, quietly and methodically, was a financial exit strategy. A private portfolio of assets accumulated in the names of LLCs he controlled, and Renee Halton co-signed, funded through proceeds from the contracting business that had been diverted before they ever reached the joint accounts he shared with Margaret, and through the arrangement with Carol Winstead that Carol had believed was a simple investment partnership. The money had been moving for years, not dramatically, not recklessly, steadily, quietly. The way water moves through limestone, so slow and so constant that by the time you see the damage, the erosion has been going on for a very long time. Patricia estimated, conservatively, that somewhere between $350,000 and $400,000 had passed through Daniel's private accounts and LLCs that Margaret had no knowledge of. Of that amount, some had been reinvested into properties. Some had been liquidated. The full picture of where the liquidity went was never completely reconstructed. And the $1 million life insurance policy, the one that listed Renee Halton as beneficiary, the one that Daniel had taken out 18 months before his death, remained frozen in legal dispute. The insurance company's fraud investigators opened a review. They flagged several elements of the policy application, including the timing and certain financial disclosures. As of the resolution of Margaret's legal proceedings, the policy had not been paid out to anyone. The keys from the locked drawer were traced, eventually, to a storage unit in a facility 22 miles outside of Clarkston. Patricia's investigator located it through a process of cross-referencing every storage facility within a reasonable radius with the unit key's manufacturer specifications. It was registered under one of Daniel's LLC names. Inside the unit were boxes of physical financial records, ledgers, receipts, property files that predated the digital trail. Some of the records went back 11 years. Some of them documented transactions that had begun, Patricia noted, within the first 3 years of Daniel and Margaret's marriage. Not after the marriage had gone cold. Not in the years of some fictional growing distance or marital dissatisfaction. Within the first 3 years, while they were still going to Gatlinburg every fall and getting dinner on their anniversary and building, to all appearances, a life together. The storage unit was also the location where, according to documentation found inside it, a second safe had been maintained at some earlier point. That safe was gone. Its contents, if any remained, were never recovered. Whatever Daniel had kept in it, he had either moved or destroyed at some point before his death. That was the detail that stayed with Margaret the longest. Not the money, not the policy, not the parallel transactions and the secret LLC names and the woman in Shelbyville. It was the empty space where the safe had been. Because it meant he had been planning. It meant he had been thinking ahead. It meant that at some point, in some future he was constructing in the background of their shared life, he had been preparing to leave, or to disappear, or to transition, from the life Margaret knew about to the one she didn't. And then his heart had simply given out before he got there. The heart attack was real. Margaret will make that clear to anyone who asks. The coroner's report was thorough. There was no indication of foul play, no toxicology findings of concern. Daniel Calloway died of a myocardial infarction at a job site on October 11th, and the manner of death was natural. He was not murdered, he was not helped along, he simply died. A man with undiagnosed cardiovascular disease and a decade of compounding stress and a secret he had been managing for years had a heart attack at 57 years old, and that was it. It was not a crime. It was not a conspiracy. It was just the ordinary, terrible randomness of the human body failing. But what it meant, given everything else that was true, given the LLCs and the accounts and the policy and the storage unit and the prepaid phone and the keys and the note in the locked drawer, was that Daniel Calloway had died before he finished what he was building. He had died mid-construction, so to speak. And he had left behind, in his wake, a wife who was the legal surviving spouse of an estate that was significantly more complicated than it appeared, a business associate who had been cooperating with investigators and had her own legal exposure to navigate, a woman in Shelbyville who had retained her own attorney and who was not, as far as Patricia's team could determine, saying anything to anyone voluntarily, and a frozen $1 million insurance policy that several parties had legal interest in. The legal proceedings that followed lasted 14 months. They were, Margaret would say, the second most exhausting thing she had ever been through in her life. The first, she said, was the marriage itself. Once she understood what the marriage had actually been, when it was over, when the attorneys and the investigators and the insurance company's fraud review had finished, and the final agreements had been signed, Margaret Calloway did not receive the $1 million. The insurance policy remained in dispute beyond the window of the proceedings she was directly involved in. But she retained the house, clear of the debts that Daniel's estate had carried. She received a portion of the value from the liquidation of assets that could be traced and legally connected to the marital estate. It was not a fortune. It was enough to be stable. And stability, Margaret would tell her sister Donna, was something she had actually always had. She had just not known for 15 years that she had been building it largely alone. Carol Winstead, the woman who sent the text that started everything, was never charged with any crime in connection with the property transactions. She cooperated fully with investigators and her own legal exposure was ultimately minimal. She had been, the review concluded, a party to arrangements she had not fully understood the structure of. She and Margaret speak regularly to this day. They have met in person 4 times. Margaret describes their friendship as one of the stranger gifts a very strange experience gave her. A woman she had never heard of, who sent a text at the worst possible moment, who turned out to be the only person willing to tell her the truth. There is something in that, Margaret has said, worth sitting with. Renee Halton has never spoken publicly about any of this. Her attorney has communicated on her behalf through legal channels, and beyond that she has maintained complete silence. She continues to live in Shelbyville. Margaret has not reached out to her and does not intend to. Margaret made that decision early in the process and has never wavered from it. She has said, when asked about it, that some questions do not have answers that would actually help, and that spending energy on those questions is a choice, and she has chosen not to make it. Margaret still lives in Clarkston. She still works at the middle school library. She is still by every account of the people who know and love her, a steady, warm, present person, the same person she was before any of this happened, or as close to that person as life now permits her to be. She has said in private conversations that the hardest part of the whole experience was not the discovery. It was not the legal proceedings. It was not the sleepless nights or the fear of whoever had tested her back door or the weight of understanding how completely she had been deceived. The hardest part, she has said, was the forgiveness she had to find. Not for Daniel, though that too, but for herself. For all the times she had noticed something and looked away. For all the questions she had decided not to ask. For all the gaps she had filled in with love and hope and the benefit of the doubt. Because that was the kind of person she had been taught to be, and because she had not wanted to be the kind of wife who didn't trust her husband. She had spent 15 years choosing peace over truth, and the truth had found her anyway, standing at a graveside, on a gray October morning, in the form of a buzzing phone and 6 words from a stranger. We need to talk. I know what really happened. And the thing that Margaret wants you to understand, the thing she asked to be included, if her story was ever going to be told, is not that she was a victim. Not only that, the thing she wants you to understand is that she was also a woman who had instincts, good instincts, accurate instincts, and she quieted them year after year because it felt like the loving thing to do. And if you take nothing else from her story, nothing else from the 15 years and the locked drawer and the note that said, "Forgive me," take that. Trust the quiet voice. Ask the hard question. Because the easier story is not always the safer one. And the truth, however long it takes, however painful its arrival, always finds a way through. I want to ask you something before you go, and I want you to actually think about it, not just scroll past it. Because I have been thinking about it since I first heard Margaret's story, and I have not stopped. If you had been in her position, if you had noticed those small things over the years, the phone always face down, the locked drawer, the explanations that were just reasonable enough to accept, what would you have done? Would you have asked the question? Or would you have chosen, as she did, the easier story? Leave your answer in the comments below. I mean it, I read every single one. And on a story like this, I genuinely want to know what you think. And if Margaret's story stayed with you tonight, if it moved you, unsettled you, made you want to call someone you love, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like hers don't get told enough. Real women's stories, the quiet ones, the ones that happen in small towns and small houses and long marriages, far away from headlines and courtrooms and cameras. They matter, and the women who live them deserve to be heard. If you're new here, please subscribe. We bring you stories like this every single week. Stories about real people, real choices, real consequences. The kind of stories that stay with you. And next week, I'm covering something that begins with a grandmother, a handwritten will, and a safety deposit box that nobody was supposed to know existed. You are going to want to be here for that one. Until then, trust your instincts. Ask the hard questions. And take good care of yourself. I mean that.